There's a kind of pain that can't be explained with ordinary words. It's not physical, and it doesn't have a clear cause, yet it settles in silently, like a fog that blurs the meaning of everything. This is the pain of being alive, and though it may seem absurd at first, it carries a deep truth. To live is to be thrown into a world without maps, with the responsibility of building your own path alone. There are no guarantees, no ready-made trails, no hidden script waiting to be discovered. There's no essence that defines who we must be. What there is freedom, and with it, the weight of having to choose. Jean-Paul Sartre called this a condemnation, not in the religious sense of the word, but as an existential realization. We didn't choose to be born, but we're forced to deal with the consequences of being here. According to him, human beings are condemned to be free, and that condemnation carries both promise and torment, because there is nothing outside of us that tells us what we must do. There's no fate, no higher plan that guarantees a direction, no fixed nature, no instruction manual. Everything we are, we become through our actions. We are responsible for every choice, even when we pretend not to be. This view breaks away from the comfortable idea that we have a given purpose, an intrinsic mission, or an unchangeable essence. No, for Sartre, we first exist, and only then do we define ourselves. Existence comes before essence. That means no one is born with a ready-made identity, with a fixed self just waiting to be revealed. What exists is an open field of possibilities, and the task of filling that field falls on our shoulders every single day. It's as if we're the authors of a book that begins with a blank cover, and every page written depends solely on our decisions, even the ones we postpone. Freedom, in this context, isn't a privilege. It's a burden. Not because it's inherently bad, but because it comes with total responsibility. And full freedom, far from being light and enchanting as we often imagine, reveals itself as a source of anguish. Faced with the infinite range of possible choices, how do we know which one is right? In the absence of a pre-established meaning, how do we create one that isn't just an illusion? And how do we hold on to that meaning when everything around us seems to float, as if any certainty were made of thin glass, ready to shatter? It's in this landscape that many people experience a quiet form of despair, the realization that we are the authors of our own lives, but without a script, without direction, without any kind of emotional or spiritual safety net, without guarantees that we're headed anywhere real. Freedom, which from a distance looks charming, up close feels dizzying, because there's no one to blame, no excuse to hide behind, only our naked consciousness standing before the vastness of what's possible. But this pain of being free, this heavy awareness of being loose in the world, isn't the end of the road. It's the beginning of something greater. We have to walk through that anguish to truly understand the nature of freedom. Because it's not just about doing whatever you want. It's about facing your own condition head on. And it's in that confrontation that we begin to touch the deepest layers of existence. It's in that abyss where the first real gesture of authenticity is born. The one where, even in fear, we choose to move forward. This anguish, far from being a mistake, is the gateway to living freedom with clarity. And in recognizing it, we draw closer to the second inevitable movement of consciousness, the experience of anguish as a constant presence, not something that fades, but something that forces us to look deeper into who we are. It becomes a lens that distorts, but also reveals, magnifying everything that is real within us. Not every burden shows up as something that drags us down. Sometimes it appears as too much open space, a vastness of choices that paralyzes. Freedom, when looked at closely, can become an endless road, where every fork seems just as uncertain as the one before. And it's in that overwhelming excess that anguish settles in, not as a passing emotion, but as the condition of someone who knows they are too free to lean on any certainty. This kind of anguish doesn't scream. It creeps in quietly, through small doubts, prolonged silences, and decisions that stall. And no matter how hard we try to rationalize it, logic alone can't resolve it. Because what fuels this anguish isn't the difficulty of making a choice, but the awareness that every decision carries the weight of giving up all the others. It's not just about opening one door, but about closing all the others, for good. Maybe the cruelest part isn't the door we walk through, but the footprints we'll never leave on all the other paths. And it's this invisible loss, this mourning for the lives we'll never live, that makes freedom so painful. Sartre didn't see this anguish as a flaw or a weakness, but as the inevitable experience of someone who's fully aware of their own responsibility. We are free, and because of that, there's no one else to blame. No excuse is enough once we realize that even inaction is a choice. Even silence speaks. Even the fear of making a mistake reveals a desire not to be the sole one responsible for whatever comes next. Even waiting can be a disguised decision, a subtle way of pushing responsibility onto time itself. There's a deep discomfort in realizing that there's no right destiny waiting for us, no higher voice clearly telling us which path to follow. Everything is wide open, and this openness, though filled with creative potential, also leaves us exposed, vulnerable in a world that offers no guarantees of meaning. The pain of being alive then becomes, at the same time, the pain of constantly having to decide what to do with that life. And each decision, no matter how small it seems, ends up becoming a gesture, either of affirmation or abandonment, in the face of the mystery of existence. It's in this space that many people end up in conflict with their own conscience. The desire to get it right crashes into the impossibility of certainty. The fear of wasting life confronts the absence of any universal standard of success. And time, which moves forward without pause, turns every decision we don't make into a ghost, a silent presence that lingers, reminding us of everything we didn't live. Each possibility ignored accumulates, not like dust, but like an invisible weight that grows quietly inside. This is the kind of wound that doesn't bleed, but throbs. The growing awareness that we're always at risk of becoming what we never wanted to be, simply because we didn't act when we had the chance. And at the same time, the cruel doubt, was there really a better path? The anguish of freedom is exactly that. A tightrope stretched between the fear of paralysis and the dizzying pull of choice. A fragile balance between the will to get it right and the terror of getting it wrong. Even so, it's right at this point of inner friction that something essential can begin to emerge. When we manage to endure the pain of not knowing and move forward anyway, we begin to see that this anguish isn't an obstacle. It's a reminder, a call to take ownership of life with more presence, more truth. Because the goal isn't to eliminate the discomfort, but to walk alongside it, eyes wide open, even when the darkness offers no clarity, even when every step feels like a risk, with no return. It's precisely in the midst of this tension that many find refuge in a subtle strategy, denying their own freedom. The desire to be led, not to lead, starts to take root. The urge to hide within rules, roles, and patterns that offer some kind of symbolic absolution, as if it were possible to shift the weight of decision-making onto something or someone else. But while this move may bring immediate relief, it comes at a high cost, and it's toward this cost that our thoughts now turn. When the weight of choice becomes unbearable, the mind finds clever ways to escape. We don't always run away. Sometimes we dissolve into normalcy, hidden in plain sight, behind unquestioned routines, socially accepted roles, and the kind of talk that convinces us life is just the way it is. This escape has a name: bad faith. Not in the moralistic sense of the word, but as Sartre defined it, a deep self-deception, where the human being denies their own freedom by pretending they have no choice, by assuming they are only what has been assigned to them. It's a subtle yet powerful mechanism. The waiter who becomes just a waiter, the employee who shrinks into their job title, the partner who vanishes into someone else's expectations, all of them, in some way, are trying to deny the vastness that terrifies them. And society, in turn, reinforces this play, applauding those who fit in, those who stick to predictable roles, those who don't disturb the quiet order of things. It's easier to deal with someone who repeats themselves than with someone who constantly reinvents their life. But this denial comes at a high cost. When we pretend we're not free, we sever the connection with the most authentic parts of ourselves. We become characters in a play that no longer moves us, repeating lines we didn't write but learned to perform with perfection. And the more we buy into that script, the further we drift from the real experience of existing. We start to live as if we were alive, and that in itself is already a form of numbness. Bad faith is comforting because it offers relief. It turns the anguish of freedom into functional routine, into mechanical occupation, but it's a fragile comfort, unstable, one that demands constant maintenance, distractions, justifications, obligations, noise. All it takes is a deeper moment of silence, a loss, a rupture, and the illusion begins to crack. Because deep down, we know we're lying to ourselves when we say we don't have a choice. We know there's a silent fire inside us that still wants to decide, that still longs to be more than a well-adjusted cog in the system. The most painful part is realizing that this escape doesn't shield us from existential pain. It only postpones it, and the longer we spend denying our freedom, the further we drift from the possibility of creating a life that truly belongs to us, a life that's not just endured, but fully lived, a life that's not reduced to surviving, but rooted in feeling, acknowledging. This takes courage. It's not easy to admit that we've been hiding from ourselves, that we've chosen passivity as a form of protection, but that admission is paradoxically liberating, because we can only change what we're willing to face. And once we take off the mask of bad faith, we begin to recover our ability to live with honesty, even if that honesty doesn't come wrapped in certainty, but in brave, open-ended questions. And it's when we begin to break free from this self-deception that something new starts to emerge. The realization that freedom, despite its weight, can lead to real transformation. But before that happens, we have to face the darkest part of the process. The moment when freedom, instead of feeling like a gift, becomes a suffocating presence, pushing us into an existential desert. And that's where the mind must now turn. Freedom doesn't always set us free. There are moments when it shows up as a sky that's far too open, where no direction feels safe and every path blurs into the horizon. When we don't know what to do with the vastness stretching out in front of us, what should be pure potential turns into paralysis. And it's in that moment that freedom, instead of celebration, feels like a crushing weight. A universe without walls, but also without ground. The possibility of being anything or everything can, at certain times, also feel like the possibility of being nothing. Because when faced with too many choices, without an internal anchor to hold on to, we begin to dissolve. And the more we try to embrace this infinity, the more we lose ourselves in its immensity. The paradox is brutal. The freer we are, the more helpless we can feel in the face of our own existence. This kind of directionless freedom doesn't feel like lightness. On the contrary, It pushes us into a state of internal exhaustion. Everything seems possible, yet nothing feels true. Everything is within reach, yet nothing truly touches us. What follows is a kind of fatigue that isn't physical or mental. It's a fatigue of the soul. The body keeps moving, but the center of being begins to fragment. And little by little, life loses its texture, its depth, its intimacy. It becomes silently dull. Some try to react by filling every space, taking on 1,000 roles, saying yes to every opportunity, diving into an existential busyness that, at first glance, looks like vitality. But underneath it all, it's desperation. It's the fear of stopping and realizing that behind the multiplicity of roles, there's still a void that hasn't been faced. A void that freedom alone cannot fill. Because freedom without direction is not enough. It requires grounding, connection, meaning. Others take the opposite route. They retreat, reduce their lives to the minimum, and seek refuge in voluntary isolation. But even there, freedom doesn't disappear. Because it doesn't live in external conditions. It lives in consciousness. It doesn't matter how small the cage we build. Freedom keeps knocking at the door, asking to be acknowledged. And that constant presence, even when denied, keeps stirring us with a restlessness that won't go quiet. It is the call of existence itself, insistent, inevitable, intimate. This final stretch is already well polished, mature, and coherent, with a high-level emotional and philosophical closure. Even so, there's room for subtle stylistic and rhythmic improvements, as well as conceptual nuances that can deepen the message without changing its meaning. That restlessness, when prolonged, can turn into despair. Because we're not just facing the difficulty of choosing, we're facing the suspicion that no choice will truly anchor us. And it's at this point that meaning begins to dissolve, and the pain of being alive reaches its rawest form. Not knowing anymore what holds meaning, or if anything is truly worth seeking at all. But it's precisely in this barren terrain that a real possibility begins to emerge. When everything feels empty, the gaze finally turns inward. When freedom reveals its darkest side, it also opens a narrow, but revealing, crack for a more intimate reconstruction. Because it's within this silent collapse that the most honest question can finally be asked. Among everything that is possible for me, what truly holds value? The answer doesn't come from outside. It won't come from others or from pre-made models. It must be built patiently through a deeper kind of listening. And it's in this return to inner life that a new form of presence begins to take shape. A freedom that is no longer defined by the quantity of paths, but by the quality of what is chosen with truth. When freedom sheds its disoriented nature, and we begin to bear the pain of choosing with awareness, something inside us shifts. The urge to multiply possibilities is slowly replaced by a quiet longing to root ourselves in something more intimate, more aligned with who we are. And at that point, a new kind of responsibility appears. Not the pressure to do everything, but the call to do it with truth. To choose not out of fear of missing out, but out of a deep commitment to self-discovery. This is the beginning of authenticity, the decision to act in alignment with what one feels, even when the whole world expects something else. It's when we stop following inherited roles and start listening to the voice that was once buried beneath layers of expectations, noise, and fear. And that listening isn't easy. It requires silence, it requires courage, it requires time. But it's precisely that listening that brings us back to ourselves, layer by layer, until we rediscover something essential that we didn't even know how to name anymore. The responsibility that arises here is more subtle, yet more demanding. It's no longer enough to simply fulfill roles or please others. Life begins to ask for integrity, a coherence between what we live on the outside and what we know on the inside. It's a quiet demand, one that doesn't come from society, but from our own conscience. And it's precisely that coherence that gives us back a kind of lightness that doesn't resemble scattered freedom, but rooted freedom. A freedom that doesn't disperse, it sustains. Because being free at this point is no longer about doing everything. It's about doing what matters, and what matters can't be defined by formulas, but by presence. It's possible to live a simple life and still be fully responsible for it. It's possible to reject the most praised paths and still live with more dignity than many who have achieved everything the world expects. Because the value of a life isn't measured by how much you have, but by how closely it aligns with what you feel is true, and with what you're not willing to compromise. This kind of responsibility, far from being a burden, becomes a form of self-care. With each choice made with integrity, the inner world becomes a little more ordered, and even if everything on the outside remains uncertain, a kind of stability begins to grow within, one that doesn't depend on circumstances, but on clarity about who you are and what you're willing to carry, protect, and keep burning. This reconciliation with freedom only becomes possible when we stop chasing it as an escape and begin to live it as a commitment to what is essential, to what endures, to what truly transforms. A freedom that ceases to be a mere impulse and becomes a conscious choice. Because freedom, when it's honest, asks only one thing of us: to be who we are, even if that costs us the illusion of being everything the world wants us to be. And in the end, it's that gesture, simple and difficult, that gives us life back.